We do have it. Okay, good. And our next speaker, Bruce Forrester. I've known him for many, many years. He used to call himself Clark Kent because of an uncanny resemblance. And I knew him way back in the early 90s when he was making these multi-wave oscillators and UFO detectors and electromagnetic field detectors. And back then I had more money than I do now, and I ordered some instruments from him. He did an excellent job of making them. They're still good. I was just very pleased with his work because there are people who are teachers, and there are people who teachers admire. They're called builders. And Bruce Forrester is a real builder. He started getting into building electromagnetic equipment back in 1980 after having read some books by Wilhelm Reich. And of course, Reich's name is going to pop up now and then in many of these presentations. He's currently living outside Dayton, Ohio. He has his own company called Zephyr Technology, where he builds MWOs and other equipment. And he's got a lot of really, really good things to say. So here's Bruce Forrester.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. What I'm going to do, so it's easier to follow along, I'm going to pass out a handout, really an outline at the top. So I've got a couple of volunteers. There's take one side and there take the other. Well, my name is Bruce Forrester and my company is Zephyr Technology. And the phrase is technology for the new age. But how did I get started and what is my background? What are my credentials? Well, if any of us watched the Democratic convention last night, we saw John Kerry. Anybody but Bush. No politics, sorry. It's war. We're back at war again. And this time we've been informed it's going to be a generational war. Not only are we going to fight, but our children are going to fight. It's going to be a war without end. War against terrorism. That is the stage we're now on. We are at war. A clash of civilizations, a clash of cultures. My background, when I first came of age, sort of was out in the world as a young man, it was the Vietnam War. And there was a military conscription, a military draft. Believe me, fellas, ladies, it was very radicalizing. And I never could quite figure out why we were going to war in Vietnam. There wasn't even any oil. Ho Chi Minh would have won the election scheduled in 1956 until the Dulles boys, John Foster and Alice Dulles, canceled those elections and installed a puppet named Diem. But that I digress. But it was during the Vietnam era, I decided not to be a soldier. I decided I would be a protester. That's what I was. I was in Students for a Democratic Society. And that experience kind of caused me to take a second look at what we were being told and why we should fight. And from that moment in the late 1960s, I realized that my path was going to be a little bit outside the norm, like all of us here. If we were totally normal and not just a little bit crazy, why would we be investigating extraordinary technology? Like my old friend Moray King, he's been at it for years and years, and he's still at it. That's good. Persistence is the key to success. So here I am today. I'm 57 years old. I'm still at it. And I have decided that my personal path is to build this technology. And yet there's a mystery, there's a problem. And I'm going to try to offer some solutions to the irrationality that seems to have overtaken us again. George Bush is not all that bad, and neither is John Kerry. I think I'll vote for Nader myself, but we're in the process of establishing an American empire. Why? Why are we doing this? What irrational forces are at work? And why was a guy like John Worrell Keeley and his great inventions suppressed? Why was Royal Rife, who actually discovered a cure for cancer, why was he hounded and taken to court? Why was Wilhelm Reich, MD? Why were his discoveries, first he was put in jail, and then his books were burned? And so the story goes. Why is it that, as Tom Valone pointed out in his recent article, Nikola Tesla said, the very wheelwork of nature is there for us. It's there right now. It's just a little bit more funding, a little bit more effort, and so many problems could be solved. Why? That is the problem. I'm going to attempt to solve it. I know what the solution is. The solution is build, build, build. So what I'm going to tell us is my personal story, how I became involved, my history of my career, what I have built, and then I'm going to jump back and talk a little bit about history. I'm going to go into some forbidden subjects, forbidden knowledge. I'm going to talk about sex, politics, and religion. Now, what does sex, politics, and religion have to do with extraordinary technology? It has everything to do. Believe me, it does. It's by reading Steve Ellswick's great magazines. You know, first there was Exotic Research and Extraordinary Technology. It's right there. It's right there for the taking, but nobody except a few like ourselves, the avant-garde, the people who can look a little bit over the horizon and see these great opportunities awaiting. And yet society is so ignorant of what we really can achieve. So, my credentials are not a PhD in science because straight science doesn't really recognize the existence of the subject we're now studying. So my credentials, my credibility is entirely hands-on. In my opinion, this statue, this bas relief, is a schematic diagram of the nature of the force. It's not my idea. It comes from Wilhelm Reich, MD. And that's how I got started way back in 1974 by reading his books, Ether, God and the Devil, The Function of the Orgasm, Character Analysis, The Cancer Biopathy, even Contact with Space. Did everybody get a handout, kind of an outline of this? Well, you're just going to have to share because we ran out. Sorry. A medical doctor, Wilhelm Reich, actually from Austria. He happened to be Jewish, but secular, non-religious, but from a great scholastic tradition. He was a German army veteran of the Great War, the war to end all wars, or so they thought. He got out of the German army on their GI Bill and went to Vienna, still as a young man. He saw combat 2 or 3 times on the Italian front, was wounded. First he studied law, then quickly switched to medicine. And Sigmund Freud was at the height of his career at that time. Wilhelm Reich, a medical student, gravitated to the coterie, the circle of scholars around Freud. And by the time Reich was 25 years old, became Freud's first clinical assistant, his #1 student. How did Wilhelm Reich, MD, wind up? He ended up by going to jail. Gee whiz. All he did was discover life energy. Sometimes we'll call it prana, or chi, or scalar, or 0 point, or the force. Luke, feel the force from the Star Wars movie. In my opinion, it's like religions. There are many names for God. There's Jehovah and the Great Spirit and God. But they all refer to the Creator. In my opinion, Wilhelm Reich, MD, a medical doctor, was the first in Western technology to correctly identify this mass-free energy of which we today are attempting to harness by our instrumentation. It is a biological energy. Now, I'm going to say a lot of things, and you can agree or disagree, and if you've got just questions that will not wait, come on down and ask them now, because I think a discourse and a dialogue is perhaps a fruitful area for instruction and to learn things. So if something you got to get out, just come on down and interrupt and blurt it right in. So what happened to Wilhelm Reich? He got busted. He went to jail. His books were burned. That's an awfully curious anachronism historically. Who else burned books? Well, let's see. The Nazis burned books, and we don't think very much of that, but the United States government burned books. And before the Nazis, I think the communists burned some books. And of course, the Catholic Church has a long history of book burning. So Wilhelm Reich's first discovery was that the energy that Sigmund Freud had outlined, there's the id, the ego, the superego, but the libido, that unconscious force within us. What is it? What is the primal moving energy? Sure enough, it's human sexuality, is how it manifests in people. And that's already, I'm on forbidden area, sex, politics, and religion. Here I'm supposed to be talking about building multi-wave oscillators, and I'm taking a little detour into human sexuality. But truth is stranger than fiction, and so this is how the story unfolds. This is how my personal path unfolded. As a student of Freud, as a psychiatrist, Wilhelm Reich realized that just talking about resistances was not enough. Freud would use this thing called resistance therapy. The patient would lay on the couch, and whatever the patient did not want to talk about, that's where Freud would take them. He would zero in on the resistance, and then the schizophrenia or the psychosis would then be unveiled. Wilhelm Reich discovered that the flow of energy within the human body was blocked by chronic muscular armor, occurring in 7 segments, which later researchers have noticed correspond to the chakras of, we'll call it the subcontinent, India, the theory of the chakras and of energy centers. The eyes, and Charles Kelly of the Radix Institute, and even Bates of the Bates method of vision improvement, have noticed that vision is not so much a deterioration of the eye, but that nearsightedness is an unwillingness to reach out and make contact with the eyes, an armoring, as Reich called it, an armoring in the ocular segment. And so the segments proceed down the body, with the innermost being the pelvic. His method of therapy was a hands-on, like a Rolfing, actually like a severe form of massage, combined with deep breathing to raise the overall energy level of the body and physically break up this armor, as opposed to entirely just speaking about it. But it has to do with life energy, prana, scalar, 0 point, tachyon, and there's many different names, almost as many different inventors give it a different name, but this energy, this free energy, anti-gravity, radiant energy that Nikola Tesla dealt with, is biological and is within ourselves. His second phase of Wilhelm Reich, things got a little warm for him in Europe. The communists, he was a communist to begin with. But he worked with people from all classes, and this was Europe, and now in the 1920s and 1930s, it was getting a little tense. There was Nazis and there were communists. There were a lot of demonstrations. Before he was through, both the communists and the Nazis decided that Wilhelm Reich was no good, and they wanted him out of there. He moved to Oslo, Norway, where he decided to study this energy first observed in the human body as human sexuality and blocked. He studied it under the microscope. He did something called Experiment 20, where he actually, in Wilhelm Reich's career is worth a whole lecture in itself, but suffice it to say that single-celled organisms have an energy field around them, somewhat similar to the halo or the energy field surrounding people. This was the second phase of his work, the Bion experiment. He wrote a book called The Bions. His lab, this is when he came to America, just at the outset of World War II. And as a physician, got a job in New York at the New School for Social Research, teaching his therapy to a group of medical doctors headed up by Ellsworth Baker, who founded the College of Orgonomy. They were psychiatrists, and they just couldn't get enough of this. He made quite a bit of money. And he bought a farm in Rangeley, Maine, a 320-acre farm, and built his Orgone Energy Observatory. And this is where he started to make some really big discoveries. This energy, this biological energy, the Force, from the Star Wars movie, Luke, feel the Force. Wilhelm Reich discovered that it could be concentrated by means of a gadget, a device, called an orgone accumulator. Orgone is a combination word for organism and orgasm, orgone, or life energy. In my opinion, and in the opinion of others, probably the leading Reichian researcher today is Jim DeMeo, who went to the University of Kansas. I think he's out in the state of near Portland, Oregon, perhaps. The orgone accumulator is a component of the Force, like a resistor or a capacitor or a diode or a battery or a tube of some kind is a component of electricity. The orgone accumulator is a component of the Force. It's pretty simple. It's built like a capacitor, almost functions like a diode. With two materials, organic and metallic, are sandwiched or layered together like a capacitor. By so doing, the observation is that the energy flows from the outside to the in. The organic material attracts and tends to hold this force, this living energy, this halo energy, whereas the metallic, typically iron, is the microphone still on? You all hear me good? The iron metal attracts it and then repels it in both directions simultaneously. So by layering these materials together, organic, metallic, the energy is attracted from the atmosphere, passed to the metallic layer. The metallic layer reflects it in both directions. What goes to the inside stays there. What goes back to the organic is held and passed back to the metallic. So a one-way flow is set up. The orgone energy accumulator. Here is a big box with an experimental subject, because remember, this technology is illegal, and the FDA actually busted Wilhelm Reich for treating cancer patients with orgone accumulators. Here's a flexible model of the orgone accumulator, the orgone energy blanket, wrapped around a knee injury from playing touch football. Wilhelm Reich observed empirically that treating cancer patients inside orgone accumulators made the tumors shrink and dissolve, and for that the Food and Drug Administration lodged a complaint against him, and a judge issued an order, a restraining order, that no more orgone accumulators could be sold or transported across state lines. One of his associates, a guy named Michael Silvert, MD, violated the restraining order and shipped a load of them from the factory in Maine down to New York to be distributed, and for that they came down and put everybody in jail. So I was not content simply to read about this and say, oh, that's cool. I had to build it. I'm not going to present a lot of theory. In my opinion, the observations made from nature, what we see and what we hear and what we feel, is more important than our theoretical underpinnings. The theories can come later. An interesting experiment with orgone accumulators called the TO-T, or the temperature experiment. 2 boxes, very similar. One's an orgone accumulator, and one's a control box without the metal, and a thermometer is placed in the top of each box. Consistently, day and night, it's warmer inside the orgone box than in the control, all other conditions being equal, except before the onset of a storm or bad weather. And then there's a reversal of polarity. Then the control box seems to be warmer by a degree or 2 than the orgone box. Yes, this violates some of the laws of physics as we know them. But this is the temperature experiment by Wilhelm Reich. So I had to do it. So I built orgone boxes out of galvanized steel, fairly common, for the 20 gauge. And galvanized steel is simply iron with a little bit of carbon in it with a coating of zinc. If it's not galvanized, it's going to rust. And the organic material, it was TeslaTech's insulation board. You have to be a little bit picky about the organic material because they'll load it up. If you go to Home Depot, the first question they'll say is, what do you want it for? They're just trying to be helpful. And if you tell them you're going to build an orgone accumulator, don't go there. Don't tell them that. And I guess they've got a lot of builders here, because when you go down to buy your parts, what do you want it for? They're just trying to be helpful, but gee whiz, if you tell them the truth, it's too much too soon. So sometimes I tell them I'm an artist, and this is a kind of a modern abstract art, and just never mind, sell them the stuff. TeslaTech's insulation board. Wool is good, fur is good. The Society of the Prevention of Cruelties of Animals doesn't like to use fur much. Fur is wonderful. Silk is good. Acrylic, not so good. Sure, it's fluffy and it has a lot of surface area, but acrylic is borderline material for orgone energy work. Steel wool is pretty good, especially for the solid types of orgone accumulators. But in the flexible blankets, steel wool tends to get lumpy. And as the blanket gets folded back and forth, that steel wool is going to lump up. This is a little 1 cubic foot thing rigged up for the temperature experiment, just about big enough to put jars of sprouts in. I've done this many times. I do not have, it's been so long ago, I've neglected to save accurately and adequately my results, but when they're plotted, sure enough, the orgone box is warmer than the control box, which does 2 things. I guess it proves the existence of the force, not that we need to do that. It also serves as a monitor of the atmospheric level of orgone energy. He did some work under vacuum with electrical excitation, and confirmed that the natural color of this life energy, of this force, of scalar, of chi, of prana, of 0 point is blue, much as the sky is blue. Around 1950, the Korean War broke out, and nuclear war was a possibility. Wilhelm Reich wondered if orgone energy could serve as an antidote to radiation sickness, since it was very healing. Reminds me of because I am going to talk about religion. I really am. Remember Jesus? Anybody remember him? That's a joke. All of his miracles were healing, each and every one. Except, I think, once upon a time when he was just a kid, he kicked over the tables of the money changers, and not too long afterwards, he turned water into wine. But every other story about Jesus was healing. The lame walk, the blind see, raising the dead. In a similar fashion, the number one application for this technology appears to be alternative medical or healing. And as we know, healing is a monopoly, a very strict monopoly, enforced by the Food and Drug Administration. And if we attend more than just a few of these conferences, we will hear of our colleagues, Jim Solomon, Ed Skilling, who got busted, who's going to jail, who's getting out of jail. So Wilhelm Reich decided, could orgone energy be applied as an antidote for a big new danger? He did the Orner experiment, the orgone anti-nuclear. Simply stated, he built a large orgone accumulator, about 20-fold, and into it put 1 milligram of radium, hoping that the effect of this concentrated life energy would neutralize, would overcome the radiation. The experiment failed in a grand way. The experiment really failed big time. Instead of overcoming the radiation, it made it much, much stronger. Instead of, as an antidote, it seemed to exacerbate or make the radiation worse, so much so that the experimental mice, which were to be put one in the control, one in the orgone accumulator, they were in their cages in the next room, they all died. They all got sick, leukemia symptoms, bleeding from the ears, bleeding from the rectum, and then they're dead. The people on his farm got the symptoms of radiation sickness. This was from a milligram, 1,000th of a gram of radium, put into an orgone accumulator. They all started throwing up, and hair starts falling out, radiation sickness. The farm, this was in 1950 and 1951. It seemed like the nuclear energy was a big irritant to the concentrated life energy. The experiment went exactly opposite, but far more severe than he could have predicted. And here the story gets a little wild. As a after effect of the Orner experiment, over his farm, these curious black clouds started to form. They were typically square. They weren't chemtrails. This was before that era. Dark, radioactive clouds, typically in a rectangular or square shape. And the Geiger counters would just go wild, and these things would hover over his farm. He wondered how to get rid of them. He noticed that water and life energy have a strong affinity for one another. And using some observations he had made years before with the effects of long metal tubes affecting the rippling or wave motion on the surface of the water, he invented a device called the cloudbuster to see if he could clean up the atmosphere. And it worked. And again, Wilhelm Reich and the cloudbuster would be worthy of a lecture all unto itself. Later, the original 1 milligram of radium, and there were several milligrams that he had used in this experiment. And I'm just giving an overview of the Oraner experiment. This radium had actually changed. About a year and a half later, it had changed its nature. It was no longer producing ionizing radiation. It had transmuted, like the old alchemists want to transmute lead into gold. He took the radium, it had changed into a new substance. He called it Orur, O-R-U-R. And when combined with the action of a cloudbuster, he now called it a space gun. And here the story gets a little wild, a little bit controversial. Because at this time, I'm going to back up. He did an experiment. He took these cloudbusters with the denatured radium out to Arizona. And in the year of 1954 and 55, in that winter, did cloudbusting work there. And sure enough, according to his observations, UFOs, or flying saucers, were observing his activities. Every time he would clean up the atmosphere over his test site, in northern Arizona, the presence of UFOs would repollute the atmosphere, similar to the effects of the Oraner experiment. He decided at that point that the UFO phenomenon, from his point of view, to kind of put it in natural terms, were similar to buzzards or fleas or ticks or lice being attracted to a dying animal. When a cow or a dog or a roadkill or a deer gets sick, starts to die, starts to putrefy, nature has a way of kind of cleaning it up. The buzzards start to circle. The bugs and the creepy crawlies show up. According to Wilhelm Reich, the UFOs that he observed were similar. They were coming to our planet. It's like the Hermetic principle, as above, so below. So to those who would say that UFOs bring us sort of peace, light, and goodness, it ain't necessarily so. They may be a symptom of our ill health. And I know UFOs are controversial, and I am not really going to discuss them, except just a little bit. But back to our main story, which is building the technology. Rather than write papers and study the mathematics and theorize, my path is just, I feel like, what can I do is build the technology, write down the observations, and others can sort it out later. And so, as well as building orgone accumulators, I built cloudbusters. And here was my first attempt, pretty much on the formula that Wilhelm Reich gave. And Wilhelm Reich, published everything he did, just like Bob Beck did a little bit later. Here's how you do it, kids. If you want to do what I did, here's my formula. You do it yourself, and if you get the same results as I do, then they're replicatable. Kind of monkey see, monkey do. So he didn't keep it secret. It wasn't proprietary. And some of this technology we'll run into, and we'll look at some of these other technologies of current researchers. Not all, but many keep things secret, like the SE5 and a few others. It's proprietary this and proprietary that. First Wilhelm Reich, and then the great Bob Beck laid down a tradition of freely disclosing how to do it and just giving it away. Even Tom Bearden, who's a real good guy, a couple years ago at the Psychotronics Convention in Columbus, he says the government can shut down one inventor, no problem. The government, the FDA, can shut down 10 or 100, but not 10,000. If 10,000 people are building this stuff, the cat's out of the bag. Build, build, build. So I was building cloudbusters. I wanted to keep it lightweight because these things do weigh a lot. Any kind of orgone accumulator weighs a ton, literally a ton. It's simply hollow steel tubes made out of steel, not aluminum. For some reason, the smelting of bauxite ore and the large amounts of electricity used produce kind of it'll work for the temperature experiment, but the subjective sensations are very irritating. Maybe there's an Oraner effect, because not only nuclear energy, but high current electricity in combination, like some people are allergic to 60 hertz electricity, or television sets, or even cell phones. There's some kind of antithetical relationship going on there. I don't have the theory to really demonstrate it, but it's a feeling thing. It's an observation thing. People report it too much for it not to be true. So it's steel. The cables are called greenfield cables or hollow BX cable. They'll say, well, what do you want it for? And if you tell them a cloudbuster, they're going to give you a real funny look, believe me. And so they say, well, we got it right here. It'll be aluminum. You have to shop around and get it made out of steel. Here's another model. This one was a little heavier, mounted on a tripod. Notice that you can see there that this model is wrapped in wool, mounted on a tripod. Notice I'm wearing this is me a few years ago down by the Missouri River near Columbia, Missouri. I'm wearing a hat. I'm wearing a red shirt and gloves. The red to be, and I really only did it because I read it in books by Trevor James Constable, who today is leading the league in cloudbuster work. And he's taken it a few steps. There's a question.
Yes, as you go through these devices, could you give us just an idea of what you've done, what data you've accumulated, how many have been built? Because you're showing us these things, but we don't have a frame of reference.
Okay, the question is, how many have I built, and is that all? How many, and what good are they?
Yeah, what kind of data do you have?
What kind of data?
Yeah.
Why have I built them? Because I can. It seems like I am driven to do so. It's not enough for me simply to read about it. I just have to do it. That's just what I have to do. Like, why does a musician play or sing? Because he can. Why did Willie Sutton rob banks? Because that's where the money is. So what good does it do? We'll see. The data. Well, I apologize for not having a printout of the temperature experiment, but we have got a lot of material, and this will be about multiple wave oscillators. How many cloudbusters I've built? I've built 2. How many orgone accumulators and orgone energy blankets? About 300. I'll say this, and that's a good question. I don't use testimonials. I never have. I've got plenty, but I never published them. I've got exactly one testimonial about the efficacy of the things I built from a medical doctor named William Bauer in Atlanta, Georgia. And mainly in that testimonial letter is in the literature I've got. It cured his arthritis. But I don't use the testimonials for 2 reasons. The first is ethical, and the second reason I don't give out testimonials is illegal. Well, the legal is easy enough. I want to stay out of jail. Because remember, this is forbidden knowledge. And we're going to talk about that here in a minute. But the ethical reasons may be more important. Since the application today of this energy technology, and that's the same energy, in my opinion, that flying saucers use to fly, our application is like Jesus. It's healing. And healing, besides being a controlled monopoly, what if someone really needs an operation? I'm not a doctor, and I don't pretend to be a physician. But what if someone needs to have an operation, and that actually is the correct way to go, but they don't want that operation because it might be disfiguring? So they think, well, so-and-so says his machine is going to heal me. I'll just go get that machine, and I won't have to face the cold, hard reality of that operation. So it's ethical. I don't use testimonials. What good is this technology? It is healing. The way I present it is I disclose it and I say, do your homework. This is a real orgone accumulator. It's not a hybrid. It's not like an orgone accumulator. It's not like a photon sound SE5 radionic Rife Lakovsky combo machine with a little, it's in there. The stuff I build tends to be a faithful replication of what has already been discovered, so those who are sincere about taking charge of their own health, I'm making the tool available. I hope that's a good answer. So the Cloudbuster. I built two and used them, but decided that why do I want to modify the world's weather? Because they are a planetary device. They have action at a distance, almost a radionic component where the force is manipulated, but the effects can be quite distant. At this time, 1977, when I built this machine.
Bruce, what was the significance of the red shirt?
Red on the color chart is the opposite of blue. And this thing tends to pull down a lot of door right on top of you. Any atmospheric pollution, like from fallout or nuclear experiments, is going to come right down on top of you. It's real easy to get pretty sick operating one of these devices. And so following the published admonitions of Trevor Constable, I used the color of the shirt to reflect some of that bad energy. Of course, gloves and a hat, and then afterwards take a quick shower, discard the clothing. These guys, some of my companions, they just did it the simple way. They just jumped right in the Missouri River. Here's a series of 3 photos of fractocumulus clouds. I wanted to see if it worked, to see if it was for real. A 1-minute time exposure, a small cloud. A minute later, it's starting to dissolve. And 2 minutes later, it's just about disappeared. Curiously, there's a technique called ocular cloud busting, which can be done with the visual ray that emanates from the human eye. And here we're kind of digressing again, but the observation, try it yourself. The best clouds are cumulus or fractocumulus clouds. Look at it and stare at that cloud and try to reach out. Here's an even simpler experiment. You're in traffic and someone pulls up next to you, and look at them. And sure enough, about 5 seconds later, they'll turn their head and stare right at you. Now, how did they know? Or in a restaurant, look at someone and they'll turn and say, what are you doing staring at me? How did they know that? There's a ray of energy that comes out our eyes. Again, many different subjects to discuss, the same principle as cloud busting, ocular cloud busting. And life energy works different than heat or mechanical energy. Something about a perfect radiator and a black body radiator. And if you set it in a room, it's going to cool off. But life energy is a little different. In living energy, in prana or scalar, the strong takes from the weak. The weak gets weaker and the strong gets stronger. So by connecting this cloudbuster to a very strong source of life energy, a body of water, it withdraws energy from the cloud. The cloud loses its energy and dissolves. To make a cloud get bigger, withdraw energy from the edge of the cloud, thus creating an artificial weak area. Then the cloud is suddenly imbalanced to this artificially created weak area, and the cloud starts to take energy from the weak area. The cloud gets bigger. So, yeah, it's a rainmaker. So not only did Wilhelm Reich discover a cure for cancer, he discovered how to manipulate Earth's weather without silver iodide and seeding clouds and even chemtrails. And out in the desert, he dealt with UFOs in this similar fashion. And I'm just going to mention it. The material's available. I've got literature. It's on the website. If you use Google, an excellent search engine, just type in Wilhelm Reich and cloudbusters and whatnot, and it'll all pop up. The one book of his that is not in print, Contact with Space, directly addresses this. But the Wilhelm Reich Foundation, called the Wilhelm Reich Infant Trust Fund, will not release that book and will not allow anyone else to bootleg it. And they've got a real bulldog lawyer in New York named Leonard Collini. And every now and then I get a certified letter from Mr. Collini threatening me with dire legal action if he catches me bootlegging Contact with Space. But copies are available. See me after the show. A schematic diagram of the force. And now I'm going to get a little controversial. I'm going to try to address the question of why, when we're so, out in the exhibit area, there's Dale Pond has a working model of one of Keeley's devices, and Sonny Ward has got some kind of motor scooter, and Tom Ballone's got his stuff, and all these people have got gadgets that are so darn close. Why are we just, we've come from all over the country to discuss extraordinary technology. Why isn't Monsanto and General Motors? I was up at General Motors in Flint, Michigan, at their, they call it Kettering University. It used to be the General Motors Technical Institute. And they were going to study the multiple wave oscillator because one of their guys bought one and his wife got it, and she had very favorable results with it. But I couldn't quite get it past the review committee. Donate a machine. They just didn't want to go there. Why is there so much resistance to this technology? It's puzzling. It's irrational. It is irrational. And yeah, they're flying saucers. Why are there flying saucers? Because people see them, that's why. Never mind the theory that says they are impossible. And according to our science, they are impossible. The speed of light being the absolute speed limit, and just a myriad of reasons. Hoax, they'll cry hoax. And yet, Gallup polls, ever since the 1950s, about every 5 or 10 years, they'll do a poll. About 10% of America and Europe, about 10% of the population in confidence will reveal that they have seen something that may not be dismissed as geese or a cloud or a weather balloon or a misinterpretation of natural phenomenon, flying saucers, which correspond, by the way, big time to our setting off nuclear bombs. Many people in this field, including Steve Ellswick, and rightly so, think, let's keep the flying saucers out of here because it discredits legitimate scientific research. And it does. The flying saucers invariably evoke ridicule or the laughter curtain or making fun of them. But in this room, say if we've got 100 people in here, about 10 of you have seen a flying saucer. And you know who you are. Popular book lately, The Da Vinci Code. According to researcher Dan Brown, in Europe, during the Dark Ages, for about 500 years, according to the best estimates, about 5 million women were burned at the stake. And think about that. 500 years, 5 million women were burned alive. In the West, this is not Islam, this is not Iraq, where they still do such things from what I hear. This is in Europe and even in America, because America basically is a colony of Europe. We're from England, we're from Italy. Well, now we're from everywhere, but we were founded as a colony. Germans, Russians, Swedes, Polacks, you name it, Irishmen. We, and these are our own people. This is not the enemy. These are not the barbarians. Have burned alive about 5 million women, our mothers and our sisters and our daughters. So 5 million over 500 years, that's about 10,000 a year in England, France, Germany, Russia. Not so much Russia, because they were the eastern flavor of Christianity. This would be Roman Catholicism, the West. In the West, 10,000 a year burnt. That's about 25 a day. Something's wrong. What's wrong with this picture? Here's a flyer from a grocery store. It's our mythology. It's our religion. Now, before I get too far into religion, truth is stranger than fiction. Today, right now, in 2004, LDS, the Baptist, not necessarily the current occupants of the White House, but fundamental Christians represent kind of the last bastion of wholesomeness, of decency, of family values. Where Christianity breaks down, we get drive-by shootings and hip-hop and crack cocaine and just, Christianity, we're going to talk about it. But today, in the 21st century, entering the new millennium, our mythology of Christian, as flawed as it is like at the Ebenezer Baptist Church and their Wednesday evening ice cream social and bean dinner. It's family values, its goodness is there. And yet the underlying mythology is way, way, way off. According to Christianity, we're all sinners, we're all bad. According to Christianity, the fundamental mythology is that our bodily functions are somehow shameful. And does this fundamental underpinnings of our culture, of our civilization, now affect our irrationality and our science? For hundreds of years, Christianity tortured people who dared to disagree. It was a monopoly, a monotheism. When the Christians moved into an area like Germany and England, members of the priestly caste destroyed, like there used to be something called Druidism, and they had big oak trees which had been there for hundreds, and they were sacred. So the first things the Christians did was cut down those trees. In Hawaii, get this, I knew a guy who was Hawaiian. There's these terrible problem in Hawaii with briars and thorn trees. And who were they planted? They were not indigenous to Hawaii. The Christian missionaries planted them so that the natives would be forced to wear shoes to church. In ancient times, pagans accepted everyone's religion, tolerance and diversity. Not that the pagan mythology really makes any more sense than the Christian mythology, but all the gods, Apollo and Artemis and Diana, Zeus and Ares and Poseidon. Remember Poseidon, Neptune, the guy with the trident? When the Christians showed up, they decided to make him into the devil. And so now the devil always has a pitchfork. That's the old god of the sea. But the pagans in the Greek civilization, the Roman civilization, classical civilization, literacy was to be praised. Literacy was a virtue. Learning was a virtue. But when the Christianity took over, it was a monopoly, a totalitarian system, somewhat like the Nazis, in that they burned books, every single one. In the handout I give you, there's a little description of the thoroughness of the destruction of all knowledge. And all books that weren't destroyed, all the myths, all the parables. It's like Jesus was a virgin birth. That came from Zoroastrianism, being born in a cave or in a manger. That was from Zoroastrianism, a precursor to Christianity. All of the myths were gathered up and put into the Bible, and then everything else was destroyed. So by the time 600, 700, 800 AD, we have no knowledge. Western Europe was totally illiterate. There's a few, just a very few, ancient ruins left, but we hardly even know our own history. Question?
Yes, it's me again. I'm here to torment you. You mentioned, or it was mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, that there would be about a 20-minute lecture, for lack of a better word, and then there would be a question and answer session. And also the topic for this particular subject was given as building multiple wave oscillator.
Yeah, multiple wave oscillators.
Okay, I'm coming to this subject as one who has not yet studied this particular avenue. And so what I would like to ask you as a question is, are you going to talk about what is on the description? Because what you're talking about here is maybe interesting, but is way off topic from what we were told we were going to be talking about today. What I would like to invite you to do is to have a dialogue with me in an interview fashion to stay on topic, or would you prefer to go on with what you've planned, which is not topic?
Well, that's an interesting question. Let's see if I can paraphrase it. The title of the lecture is Building Multiple Wave Oscillators, and the material so far is setting the stage to building this technology as a way of gaining further knowledge. So hang in there, and we're soon going to get into the hands-on building multiple wave oscillator techniques. Fair enough?
Okay. And I don't know how long your presentation is, but it seems like at the pace you're going, the chances of actually getting into an in-depth analysis is not very high. And so, based on this response, I would like to invite you to maybe alter what you had planned on doing and perhaps engage me in a dialogue about what is a multiple wave oscillator. Would that be fair enough? No? I got a nod over here that says no, so I'll go ahead and sit down and let you go at your own pace. But I guess my input is that it seems like you're going in a different direction than what we came here to listen today, and I would like to invite you to address the topic, talk about data, what does this thing do, how does it work, and how can you build one, and why do we want to build one, rather than just say, go and build one and find out. That's what you're here today to do, to tell us is, what does this thing do? So help us out here, because I'm not interested in your device yet, because you're talking about all this other stuff. I have no idea what this thing is. So my invitation, my question is, what is a multiple wave oscillator?
The reason why we have a lot of these speakers here, because they are the foremost experts in their field, and respectfully, some of them, because many people lack certain aspects of background and common frame of reference, they're putting their presentation together and building first a foundation, then the bricks. So if we can be patient and let him finish his presentation as he had planned, I think that we'd probably get the most out of it. We can cut to the chase, and there's some of us that will get the net result very, very quickly, but there's a lot that we'll leave behind. So if we could beg your patience and your grace there, let's let him finish his presentation as he planned it, okay?
All right.
It's a good question, and I want the questions because I know that I can be controversial, and I'm trying to tone it down. At other groups, I get even more carried away than today. So I'm trying to be a good boy and be on my best behavior. Michael Riversong has seen me in my wilder days. And yet I could treat the symptom But what about the underlying cause? Like, why did Wilhelm Reich go to prison for curing cancer? Why was Royal Rife he was bankrupted by the Food and Drug Administration, finally had to go into exile in Mexico. And why are some of us, if we continue this path, risking our freedom and our liberty? So I'm giving part of the problem, the historical problem, and I'm giving us the solution too. But if I've stirred you up a little bit, that's good. I'm successful. Who was it said, if I don't get any questions, I'll start to worry? All right. Moving right along here. Let's see if we can get into some multiple.
Controversy. That's not the issue.
Good. Okay. So the Christians in their fealty and their religious zeal were almost successful in destroying all knowledge. And remember, we're going into war, a generational war. Did you hear John Kerry's speech last night? George Bush took us to war. John Kerry is war. We have a choice between war and war. The war party owns both the Republicans and the Democrats. And war is no fun. And if not us, then who? Because I consider this material to be revolutionary technology. Just ask anyone who gets even a hint of success. Copernicus. He was a smart guy. He published after he was dead. He knew the penalty for science, for truth. By looking through the telescopes that had recently been discovered, he could figure out that the sun was the center of the solar system, but he was smart enough to know that if he went out and published that, he'd go to jail or maybe worse. Giordano Bruno was a little more idealistic. He preached and published and wrote and lectured about the new cosmology and would not recant. It's unfair, but I'm going to say it. Maybe like our friend here, he was told to get back on subject or face the consequences. And the consequences, he was burned alive in 1600. For what? For his science. For simply stating and proving that the sun is the center of the solar system. Today, since we are outlaws, we are outside the bounds of science. How many people here have a doctorate in what we really do? I don't think anyone does. If we can even get close to getting a doctorate and getting tenure about what our passion is, then we are truly the first to do so. What we are doing is illegal. It's illegal science, it's forbidden knowledge. Giordano Bruno was put to death. The classical world, while they did not have our techniques, they did not have cell phones, jet aircraft, but they had a tolerance and a willingness to accept diversity. All religions were considered equally valuable, all viewpoints. The scientific method was worked out, observation and experiment. Today, we're working our way back, but we've had to start from scratch. And yeah, there are extraterrestrials. I'm not going to prove it, but I'm only going to say that there have been enough recorded observations. People see them, they write it down. The proof can come later. That is the scientific method. Today, we're getting things like crop circles. And I know that some of you feel uncomfortable with this. I absolutely know it's true. They say this is supposed to be multiple wave oscillators. This is supposed to be reputable science. But this phenomenon is going down, and it has everything to do with the technical things that here on Earth we are trying to accomplish. Hear me now, believe me later. Here's what can happen. Let's say we enjoy a small measure of success and we try to get a grant or we try to get funding. Well, we probably won't be burned at the stake, but we can be laughed at and we can be denied funding and be considered a crackpot or a crank. But the field of alternative medical technology, the old American free enterprise method, which is still alive and well, gives us a way to lift ourselves up by our own bootstraps. I think funding's a dirty word. But right out here in this exhibit area and at the Psychotronics Congress, and it used to be at the Global Science Congress, there are enough people in our society who will embrace this technology to make it viable economically. The logo of Zephyr Technology. In the springtime, there's a wind that starts to blow. It's called the spring zephyr. It's the first warm breezes of spring that heralds the coming of a new season. Like the summer winds or the Santa Ana, the cold northern winds or the boreal winds, the spring zephyr. 5 minutes, oh my gosh. How does time go by so fast? Okay, we'll just skip over it. It's in your handout. Bob Beck. And hey, I might just take more than 5 minutes. Bob Beck, one of my mentors, he said, Bruce, build this stuff, make them more powerful, don't go the radionic way, more power. Here's what he said. A 22 bullet will not go through a phone book, but a 357 will. If a multiple wave oscillator has more power, it will break the skin effect, the boundary layer of the skin, and those healing frequencies will penetrate the entire body. And yes, I'll use the word healing, even though that's a forbidden, illegal word, because like monotheism, a monopoly, healing is a monopoly. Georges Lakhovsky, he had to run away from the Russians and the communists because he was like an aristocrat. So he was in hot water, went to Paris, got a job as a piano tuner. And the idea is pretty simple. Using a Tesla coil and 2 large concentric ring antennas, he sets up a spread of electromagnetic frequencies. The idea is like the tuning fork. And I take a tuning fork and I bring it next to the piano string. And if the two are in resonance, one will make the other vibrate. And that's how the multiple wave oscillator works. It's so simple. And the multiple wave oscillator with a spark gap Tesla coil puts out nearly every frequency from audio frequencies, peaks out around 750 megacycles, just below the hard stuff. So the human body is able, by the principle of resonance, to vibrate in sympathy with a spread of frequencies. There was another guy named Royal Rife who used resonance, but here he had just one frequency called the mortal oscillatory rate, and he loaded up the power. And he chose a target like the cancer cell or the cancer virus, the BX virus, a pleomorphic thing that would change around, but he could target these frequencies and actually, like the violin player, shatter the wine glass. Same basic technology, vibrational frequency technology, but used in different ways. The Rife machine destroys the disease. The multiple wave oscillator induces a rejuvenation response because the cells are only capable of vibrating according to their original structure, determined by their coil, DNA coil with inductance and the distributed capacitance and the surface area of the membrane. And actually that is worthy of an entire lecture unto itself. I use an impulse DC circuit rather than alternating current, based upon the work of Bob Beck, basically. Unlike many other type units which will plug in some sort of alternating current transformer, a neon sign transformer, and step it up, and then the spark gaps, and then it comes out the Tesla coil. I wish to avoid that 60 hertz envelope. The subject is put between two antennas. A lot of improvement, I think, can be achieved in the antenna structure. This is the golden ratio. And I've always had trouble pronouncing this word, so I'm going to give it a shot. Fibonacci? Am I close? The Parthenon. Now, how did they know that? The ratio is 10 to 16, or 3 to 5, or 5 to 8, or 1 to 1.61834, and it's like a prime number. It goes on and on and on. We'll call it 10 to 16 is the ratio. And with a golden ratio antenna put together by Eric Dollard of Borderland Science a few years ago, it's a good compact antenna that's portable and rugged. And notice on the back, there are little strips that cover the gaps, giving the illusion of a solid ring antenna, like a 3D effect. Let's back up. Bob Beck said, hey, you don't have to buy this stuff, you can build it yourself. To make an antenna that works good, a piece of acrylic, the tin foil, and a razor knife, and voila, a multiple wave oscillator antenna. Don't take my word for it. That's why I'm not really going to give a theoretical lecture heavy with math and formulas. The solution to the problem, in my opinion, is to build this technology ourselves. Because that's what we do. Build it ourselves. Wilhelm Reich published every schematic he had, except the Orgone energy motor. Bob Beck, he published everything. And everything I build, I also publish it, so that others can exercise true peer review. An attachment. The violet ray wand. Plasma is a state of matter. We've got water, it's a solid. Water is a liquid. Water is a gas. There is another state of matter, a plasma. Most substances can be driven to a plasma by heat or radiation or ionizing electricity, such as the noble gases, argon in particular, or neon, or the others. And then they become conductive and they radiate. Thus, using an enclosed plasma of gas and a wand, these frequencies can be put to specific spots, such as prostate or breast, arthritis in the knee, or the lower back, or wherever it hurts. Whereas the antennas can take this vibrational technology and affect the whole body. A Tesla coil. I use a liquid-filled coil. It's a quarter wave close coupled. The reason I like that, so it can be in a small package. A pancake coil takes up a huge amount of space. The liquid is mineral oil as the dielectric. Acrylic and good old airplane glue, clamp them together and you got it. The secondary is about 720 turns of number 32 gauge enameled copper wire, whereas the primary is number 14 gauge tinned stranded wire, approximately 19 turns. That's done by the cut and shoot method. I could go back and calculate it, but with all the variables of humidity and distributed capacitance, it's an inexact science. Some details on putting these together. The spark gap, tungsten. It's an adjustable spark gap. I use 2 adjustable tungsten gaps in series, air quenched with a fan. Typical layout. I think here actually I've got the spark gaps a little close to the Tesla coil. I may move them a little farther away because the unit's fairly high power, and if you're not careful you can get a little shock. But since it's an impulse DC device, there's no AC present. They run off a battery. I know there's the old controversy between Edison and his direct current, and Tesla alternating current. But for building this technology in high voltage, I like pulsed DC, just for safety if nothing else. And the Amish, believe it or not, despite their old-fashioned ways, love things like this. And they run everything off a 12-volt DC because they typically make their own electricity. Typical layout of the spark gaps: the Tesla coil, the auto coil with a big stick diode, which are still available. Capacitors are always a bottleneck. To get a good capacitor, I've yet to find good ones. But there's a website called the GEET Group. They're up in Michigan, and they're just devoted to capacitors. Plus, in my literature, Rankin and Hauser in Moraine, Ohio, gets a pretty good capacitor at 30 kV at 0.01 microfarads. They're $30 a pop, undressed, and you got to wrap them up yourself. But they're available, and they'll sell them to you, and I've published that in my material. So I've given away both the diagrams and the sources of parts. Whoops. A 555 timer circuit and either a MOSFET or a Darlington, all this does is chop the DC voltage from a frequency of about 200 cycles on the low end up to where the automobile coil cuts out at around 1100 hertz. The circuit will go higher, but the coil itself, that's where it peaks. My next improvement will be what I call the Bodine variation, after Oliver Bodine, who I met last November at Tom Ballone's excellent conference. He says, well, Bruce, just use 2 autocoils and you'll solve a lot of problems. So I'm taking this circuit and adding a flip-flop to get a 50% duty cycle out of the timer so that I can drive 2 autocoils and solve some heating problems and make the thing run a little smoother. And typical treatment of a high voltage autocoil, I'm going to give away one of my techniques, is clear vinyl tubing for wrapping wires. You've got 2 boundary layers. You've got the boundary layer of the original wire, the air in between, then the boundary layer of the clear vinyl tubing makes a pretty good high voltage wire. High voltage is like water. It really will leak. And clear vinyl works real good. These are stick diodes. Now they're called NTE 510s. There's a lot of them around. They're used in color TV sets, and there's a generous supply available. Typical layout. The case is tricky. This is a black neoprene photographer's case. It machines well. You can put screws in it. You can do everything to it, except it's very difficult to glue to. The best glue I like is thickened Serrano acrylic crazy glue with accelerator. It's sold by hobby shops. It's your best all-around glue. Just don't glue your fingers together and try to keep it out of your eyes, okay? The second best glue is thermal glue. Thermal glue is the only thing I've found that will stick to black neoprene. Another good glue is called marine goop. It's a butyl toluene. It's pretty toxic fumes, whereas acrylic glue is your sniffing glue. 30 seconds. You think I can wrap it up in 30 seconds? I got to go fast. A look at the competition. There's the Vibe machine. They've done a nice job on their antenna with noble gas tubes available from Edmund Scientific, but it's an alternating current device, as are all the patents by Larry Azure, even though they're using 3 basically neon sign transformers trying to mimic or imitate Tesla's polyphase. Nice try, but the 60 hertz is in there, plus all the junk from the grid. And when I say junk, I mean nuclear power. So the Vibe machine and its imitators, basically anything patented by Larry Azure, is an alternating current device. In the lower right-hand corner is a radionic device from Bruce Copen. Looks like a multi-wave oscillator, but it's radionic. In the top right is a design invented by Ralph Bergstresser, neon sign transformer, full of 60 hertz, but a nice try on replicating the original antennas of Lakovsky, solid metal, sometimes different kinds of metal. They're difficult to set up because to get them evenly spaced is almost impossible, and transporting them is impossible. And of course, the photon sound beam, which is a flyback transformer type device using the multiple wave oscillator in name only. Me at the recent conference there with a couple gadgets. It is a healing rejuvenation machine. That's exactly what it is. It's illegal for it to do that, but that's what it does. Just like the miracles of Jesus Christ, they're healing. That's what this technology does. It heals, and that's illegal. Medicine is a monopoly, just like monotheism is a monopoly. It used to be they'd burn you. Well, now they incarcerate you.
Okay, Bruce?
And I'm done.
Thank you. Okay, we'll have a short break, and then we'll be right back.